The Exact Science of Matrimony. One day, the two men, Jeff Peters and Andy Tucker, decided to open a marriage business to make some quick and easy money. The first thing they did was to write an advertisement and publish it in newspapers. Their advertisement was as follows: a charming widow, beautiful, a good housewife, 32 years old, wants to remarry. She possesses $3,000 cash and owns valuable property in the country. She would prefer a poor man with a loving heart, as she realizes that the real virtues are often found in the humble people. No objection to an elderly man or to one with plain appearance, but he must be faithful and true, and know how to manage property and invest money. Send address with details of yourself. Write to Peters and Tucker, agents, Cairo, Illinois. Signed, Lonely. When they finished writing the ad, Jeff Peters said to Andy Tucker, "So far so good, but where is the lady?" Andy looked at Jeff with surprise. "Why should there be a lady?" he asked. "Now listen," Jeff answered. "You know my rule. In all my illegal activities, we must obey the law. Everything offered for sale must exist. You must be able to produce it. In that way, I have kept out of all trouble with the police. Now, for this business, we must be able to produce a charming widow, with or without the beauty." "Well," said Andy after thinking it over, "maybe it will be safer in case an inspector would try to investigate our agency. But where can you hope to find a widow who will waste time on a matrimonial project that has no marriage in it?" Jeff said that he knew such a woman. "An old friend of mine, Zeke Trotter," he said, "used to work in a tent show. He made his wife a widow a year ago by drinking too much alcohol. I used to stop at their house. I think we can get her to work with us." Mrs. Trotter lived in a small town only 60 miles away. She was not as young and beautiful as in the advertisement, and did not possess valuable property. But she looked nice, and Jeff decided to give her the job in memory of her husband. "Is this an honest deal, Mr. Peters?" she asked Jeff when he told her what they wanted. "Mrs. Trotter," said Jeff, 3,000 men in this unfair country will try to receive your fair hand and your money and property through our advertisement. What can they give in exchange? Nothing except the carcass of a lazy and good-for-nothing fortune seeker. Me and Andy will teach them a lesson. Does that satisfy you?" "It does, Mr. Peters," she said. "I was sure you wouldn't go into anything dishonest. But what will my duties be? Do I have to reject these men personally, or can I throw them out in bunches?" "Your job, Mrs. Trotter, will be easy," said Jeff. "You will live in a quiet hotel and have no work to do. I and Andy will take care of all the letters and the business finale of it. Of course," added Jeff, "some of the applicants may like to come and see you in person. Then you will have to meet them face to face and reject them. You'll be paid $25 a week and hotel costs." "Give me 5 minutes," said Mrs. Trotter, "to put some powder on my face, and you can start paying me." So Jeff Peters and Andy Tucker placed their advertisement in newspapers across the country. They put $2,000 in a bank in Mrs. Trotter's name. They gave her a bank book to show if anybody questioned the honesty of their marriage agency. Jeff was sure that it was safe to leave it in her name. Their ad in the newspaper started a flood of letters, more than 100 a day. Jeff and Andy worked 12 hours a day answering them. Most of the men wrote that they had lost their jobs, but they were full of love and that the widow would make the best bargain of her life to get them. Jeff and Andy answered every letter. They informed each applicant that the widow had been deeply impressed by his interesting letter and asked him to send a photo and more details. They also told all the applicants to enclose $2 to cover the cost of giving the second letter to the charming widow. Almost all the men sent in the $2. It seemed to be an easy business. A few clients came in person. Jeff and Andy sent them to Mrs. Trotter, and she rejected them. Soon, Jeff and Andy were receiving about $200 a day. One day, an inspector came by, but they showed him the bank book with the $2,000 to her name, and he was satisfied. After about 3 months, Jeff and Andy had collected more than $5,000, and they decided it was time to stop. Some people were beginning to question their honesty, and Mrs. Trotter seemed tired of her job. So Jeff went to her hotel to pay the last week's salary and to say goodbye. He also wanted to receive her check for $2,000 that had been put into her bank account. When Jeff walked into her room, she was crying like a kid who did not want to go to school. Now, he said, what's it all about? Did anybody hurt you? No, Mr. Peters, she said. I'll tell you. You were always a good friend of my husband. Mr. Peters, I'm in love. I love a man so hard I can't bear not to get him. He's the ideal I've always had in mind. Then marry him, said Jeff. Does he return your feelings? He does, Mrs. Trotter answered. But there is a problem. He will not marry me unless I give him the $2,000. His name is William Wilkinson. Jeff felt sorry for her. Mrs. Trotter, he said, I'd be glad to let you take this money and give it to Mr. Wilkinson so that you could be happy. But I have to talk to my partner about it. Jeff returned to his hotel and discussed it with Andy. I was expecting something like this, Andy said. You can't expect a woman to cooperate with you when it involves her emotions. It is sad to think that we are the cause of breaking a woman's heart, Jeff said, and Andy agreed with him. Go to Mrs. Trotter, he told Jeff, and tell her to take the money out of the bank and give it to this Wilkinson fellow and be happy. Jeff jumped up and shook Andy's hand for a long time. Then he went to Mrs. Trotter. She cried as hard for joy as she had cried for sorrow. Wouldn't you like to meet Mrs. Trotter before we leave? Jeff asked Andy. She'd like to express her thanks to you. Why, I think not, Andy said. I think we should hurry and catch the train. Jeff was putting all the money they had received in a belt that he tied around his body when Andy pulled a roll of large bills out of his pocket and asked him to put them with the rest. What's this? Said Jeff. It's Mrs. Trotter's $2,000, said Andy. How did you receive it? Jeff asked. She gave it to me, said Andy. I called on her 3 evenings a week for more than a month. Then you are William Wilkinson? Jeff asked. I was, Andy said.